Trinity Church on the green. I can see by the glimmers of green that people are in the St. Patrick's Day spirit. Today is also the second Sunday of Lent and the second Sunday in our series on trauma and grace. And we are especially honored and blessed to have with us this morning Chief of the New Haven Police Department, Anthony Campbell. He's Chief of Police until the end of the month. He has been serving the police department in New Haven for 21 years, since 1998 when he joined the force. He has served in many capacities of leadership in the force, and in 2017 was appointed unanimously to serve as the chief of the police department. Anthony is originally from Harlem and is a graduate of Yale College and also of Yale Divinity School, where he continues to serve on the faculty there. He's not leaving the city of New Haven. He lives here with his wife and 3 children, and he will be serving in the state DA's office, which is located here in New Haven. We are so fortunate to have such a servant leader in our midst this morning, but in our community in general, and so grateful for his leadership. And Anthony, we welcome you here to Trinity on the Green and to the pulpit for this 11 o'clock service. So thank you for being here.
Good morning. Come on, you could do better than that. Good morning.
Good morning.
First and foremost, I want to say thank you for having me here. I want to say special thanks to Kyle, who invited me. I think it is rather appropriate that at the end of my career, I have this opportunity to speak to you about trauma and grace. Throughout my life, I've had quite a bit of experience, especially as a police officer, with trauma, but also with grace. The reading today, the story about Abraham, originally Abram, I love that it starts out with God saying to him, "Do not be afraid." And that means a lot to me because there have been times in my life where God has spoken to my heart, and those words, "Do not be afraid," have been very profound, especially during traumatic events. Typically, when we think about the word trauma, you think about a specific event, something that happens in a moment, a car accident, a sudden death, someone overdoses, someone is seriously injured. But in this story that we read about Abram, he's been experiencing a trauma over the length of his life. He finds himself at a point in his life where he does not have a child. He does not have an heir to all the things that he's worked hard for. And he feels like he's been let down, that a servant, a slave, will inherit all that he has worked hard for. He is, through his life experience, traumatized. And God tells him in that moment, "Do not be afraid." And I relate to this because, as Kyle pointed out, I grew up in Harlem, New York in the 70s and 80s, so I'm dating myself. And during that time, I watched as the crack epidemic ravaged my neighborhood. You see, my mother was a New York City corrections officer at Rikers Island, and my father, on the other hand, was a drug dealer. He was dealing the very things that were destroying our community. And I could never reconcile how my mother, who was a corrections officer, but loved and adored my father, how she reconciled this reality that the person that she loved was selling drugs, as she was a law enforcement officer. And I found myself being in a place where my father told me, "You're smart, go to school, stay out the street. If I ever catch you in the street, it's going to be a problem." And I knew he meant it. And I couldn't understand that he knew that what he was doing was wrong, and yet he wanted to support his family and provide a better life. He provided that life. he and my mother and my grandparents, so much so that I was able to get into Yale University. And in 1995, after I graduated, I received a phone call. I missed the call, so there was a message on the answering machine. This was long before cell phones and voicemail. So I hit the button on the answering machine, and there was a message from my mother, and she was crying. She said, "You have to come home." So I hopped in the car and drove down to New York City. And when I arrived, my godbrother met me on the steps of the apartment building where I'd grown up. And he said, "I'm so sorry. It's your father. He committed suicide." I was 22 years old. My father and mother had me very young. My father was 40 years old when he passed away. And I found myself hurting, having experienced this immediate trauma, and wondering what would the future hold for me, for I had lost the person who had been a hero. Even though he had been selling drugs, which he knew I didn't approve of, he was still my father. He was still the person who protected me, who provided me with guidance and leadership. And I wondered what would happen with my life now that he was gone. I found myself in pain, and when I returned back to Connecticut, I was living on Dwight Street not far from here, and shortly thereafter, in the numbness of that trauma, I found myself surrounded by members of my Bible study group from Yale. And their very presence being there helped me to get through. I remember one of them in the living room as I sat in the bedroom praying amongst themselves. I remember them praying and one of them saying, "Lord, please help Soup," as they call me because of my last name being Campbell. Please help Soup not to be afraid. Help him. Meet him where he is. Comfort him. You see, what I've come to learn in life is this: where there is trauma, there is an opportunity for grace to flow. The members of my Bible study group provided that grace in that moment where I needed them. The grace to be able to speak life into me, to help me to get to a place where I was able to be healthy again and apply to the police department. Some years later, in 1998, I found myself in the police academy and then graduating, patrolling the streets of New Haven. Once I found myself assigned to the detention area, which is where someone who's arrested gets brought in to be processed. People are not usually very happy when they're down in detention. And because of the safety issues, as an officer, you're not allowed to have any equipment. No pepper spray, no weapon, no taser. But you have to fingerprint the people who have been arrested. And I found myself at 150 pounds, dealing with a gentleman who had been brought in, arrested by our department for shooting. And he was very angry. I could hear him in his cell screaming, yelling that he couldn't wait to get his hands on the police. And of course, knowing that they had to bring him out to me for fingerprinting, I was afraid. This gentleman was 6'4", about 240, 250 pounds, and I'm 6'1", at the time maybe 150 pounds soaking wet. And I thought to myself, what's going to happen here? But I had been praying before this and asking God, how could I meet people? How could I reach them when they experience trauma? How can I meet them when they're in the most difficult places? And God had given me a word. And that word was one word, and the word was candy. And I know it sounds strange, but that was the word that God gave me. So I found myself before my shift going to the store and buying a large bag of Twizzlers. So when the marshals brought this gentleman out, I was eating a Twizzler. He approached me. He was very angry. You could see it in his entire body. And as he approached, the Spirit moved to me and told me, offer him a Twizzler. And imagine the demeanor of a man who is angry at the world, hurt, angry at me because of the uniform I'm wearing or what it represents. But in that moment, when he approached and I said, "Would you like a Twizzler?" his entire demeanor changed. It was like he was a child. And he said, "Yes, I would like a Twizzler." Suddenly I found that we were talking to one another as I fingerprinted him. And as I shared my life story with him and as he shared his life story with me, I found that we had a lot in common. And that it was simply by the grace of God that my path had gone in one direction compared to his path that had gone in another direction. I fingerprinted him, entered all the information into the computer, and by the time I was done, as he was parting, he had finished his Twizzler, and I said, "Would you like another?" And he said, "Yes, officer, I would." I gave him that Twizzler, and he left me and went back to his cell. About a year and a half later, I found myself in the grocery store with my family, shopping in plain clothes, and I heard someone yell out, "Campbell!" And I looked, and I saw this gentleman. I didn't recognize at first. He came up to me, shook my hand, gave me a hug, and said, "Do you remember me?" I said, "No." And he said, "Remember in detention you gave me that Twizzler?" Suddenly I remembered, and I said, "Yes, I do remember you now. It was the shooting, wasn't it?" He said, "Yes, it was." And he said, "I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for treating me with decency and respect. Thank you for giving me a moment of peace in a time that was really difficult for me. Thank you for acknowledging my humanity." He shook my hand, acknowledged my wife and my children, and he went about his way. It reminds me of the story that we read this morning with Abraham, how God tells him to come outside and to look up at the stars, to count them if he could, and told him that you will have descendants that will outnumber those stars. That God met Abram where he was and spoke life and provided grace in that moment, transforming him so much so that he changed his name from Abram to Abraham. I'm reminded that in moments of trauma, there are opportunities where the grace that lives within each of us, especially those of us who are children of God because we know Christ, opportunities to speak life into others, to provide that grace. It doesn't have to be a moment where someone is arrested. It doesn't have to be a moment where someone has lost someone. If you look around, if you open your eyes, there are constant opportunities for us to provide that grace to someone who may be hurting right amongst us if we simply look and listen. I've seen that grace in my profession when in 2006, May 16th, 13 years to the day yesterday, I was working not far from here when a young man from Bridgeport came up to participate in a gang initiation with 2 other people in his vehicle. And the longest short of it is that he wound up running me over with his vehicle. And I found myself waking up to the voice of one of my coworkers calling me, initially thinking that I'd heard the voice of Jesus, only to find that it was one of my coworkers who was as far removed from Jesus as possible. But being awakened and finding that I could not move my right arm and my right side, finding that I was paralyzed for about a year and a half after my injury, wondering how I would provide for my family as the sole source of income. How would I be there for my boys who at the time were 3 and 5? How would I provide for my wife? Not knowing, finding myself in a place of fear, wondering what the future would hold. Finding myself having life spoken into me by members of the police department, members of my congregation, who said that God is not done with you yet. I remember someone who spoke the words of Jeremiah 29:11 to me and said, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. In that moment of trauma, someone spoke and utilized that grace that was within them and spoke that into me. I found myself sitting in the office of the neurologist who was telling me that I needed to retire because I would never be able to be a police officer again, that I may never regain movement in my right arm, and my leg, and my neck. And I remember God's Holy Spirit speaking to me in that moment and saying, speak to him and say this: I know that you practice medicine, but I know the master healer, and he is not done with me yet. I found myself at the divinity school taking classes while I was out injured and having an Old Testament proctor say to me, I want you to go and see this woman because I believe she can help you. And I went and saw this woman who started treating me in such a way that little by little, movement came back to my right arm. Within a year and a half, I found myself back at the police department on a light duty basis, and within 2 years on a full duty basis, being promoted to the rank of sergeant. And 9 years after returning to the police department, I found myself 2 blocks away at City Hall, being sworn in as the chief of police. All of these things were moments where trauma had occurred over a period of time and in instances, but opportunities for grace to flow through God's people, through other human beings into my life. I've tried to allow that same grace to flow through my life. And in that moment where Mark Andrews was being sentenced, I wrote a letter. I didn't share this with the first service, but I'll share it with you. I wrote a letter to the court stating how my life had been drastically changed because of what Mark had done when he ran me over with that car. But that as a Christian, I remembered that there was a time where a man who never met me hung on a cross because of my sin so that I would have an opportunity to live a life and have a relationship with God. That grace that was poured out on that cross that day was for me, was for all of us as children of God, and I asked the judge to extend that grace to Mark Andrews and to have leniency on him. And the judge did. Rather than give him the 20 years he had planned on giving him, he cut that sentence in half, per my request. We are all blessed. Literally, when God breathed his life into Adam, he breathed a part of himself into human beings. We have the Spirit of grace, God's grace, living within each of us. And it is up to us to share that grace every day in every opportunity that we have with those who are experiencing trauma. My hope and my prayer is that today, some word that I've shared with you will inspire you, will help you to, in a moment that may not even seem like a traumatic moment, to bear witness to something that someone may be going through. It may be someone who is sitting here today near you, a family member, someone in your community. There are numerous ways in which you can speak life and implore that grace that lives within you into the life of someone who is around you. And I hope that maybe someday someone will allow the grace that lives within them to bless your life. Thank you. May God bless you and keep you.